In the 90s, if you needed help beating the turbo tunnel level on Battletoads, you didn't have Google to turn to. Instead, you called the Legends, Nintendo's video game counselors. These were the experts who could guide you through nearly any game you could throw at them. But what most people don't realize is that behind the scenes, there was so much more to the story. From unlimited game access, intense boot camp style training, wild parties, limo rides, even some super fans and celebrity status. Today we're diving into the untold history of Nintendo's gameplay counselors, the unsung heroes who helped millions conquer gaming's greatest challenges. In the 80s and 90s, video games were notoriously difficult, and Nintendo titles were among the hardest. Games like Battletoads and Silver Surfer have gone down in history as some of the most difficult video games of all time. The Houston Press referred to this as the Nintendo Hard Era, a time when games universally felt like they hated us for playing them. In fact, it was speculated that this rising difficulty was intentional, a strategy designed to counter the video game rental industry. The idea was, the tougher the game, the longer it would take to beat, increasing the likelihood that players would buy the game rather than just rent it. Nintendo eventually would find a solution to this problem, though it wasn't part of their original plan. In fact, the need for such a solution only became clear when Nintendo launched a consumer support hotline. Initially, the hotline was only meant for basic product support, help with setting up new Nintendo systems and troubleshooting RF cables, but eventually this hotline would become flooded with calls about gameplay questions. How do I beat this level, or where do I find this item? Recognizing the growing demand, Nintendo gradually expanded its team with specialists dedicated to helping players navigate their games.
This is Jay, how can I help you?
Yeah, I'm playing Super Mario World, and I can't find the second exit in the cheese bridge.
Okay, what you're going to need to do on that?
Initially, gamers could call these experts for free, only needing to cover long-distance charges. While this may have seemed like a generous move by Nintendo, there was a strategic motive behind it. If gameplay counselors could help you beat your current game, you'd be more likely to go out and buy a new one. However, after a few years, Nintendo shifted to a pay-per-minute 1-900 number, adding a new layer of profitability. This dedicated group of experts hired became known as Nintendo Gameplay Counselors, and in the early days, the team was quite small, starting with just a handful of specialists. The qualifications to join were minimal, with many counselors being fresh out of high school, lured in by a simple ad that asked, "Do you like video games?" As the program expanded though, Nintendo introduced a written exam to filter out unqualified candidates. Although the test was fairly straightforward for any avid gamer, reports would later surface of cheating. One former counselor recounted a clever strategy he used, cutting out small pieces of paper to fit behind the lenses of his large Ray-Ban sunglasses, writing down all of the answers his friend had provided him conveniently in advance. Once candidates passed the test and were hired, they faced an intense training program, often referred to as the Nintendo Boot Camp. Trainees were subjected to grueling pop quizzes and were expected to provide answers on the spot to highly specific video game questions. For many, the pressure was intense and nerve-wracking. After training was complete, counselors were thrown into the deep end, handling calls that covered everything from basic tips to deep dive questions on Nintendo's extensive game catalog. Even the most dedicated gamers couldn't possibly know every intricate detail about each title on the market. So to help keep them up to speed, Nintendo provided several interesting resources. First, each counselor had access to a Nintendo or Super Nintendo console right at their workstation. This allowed them to play through games as needed. The second resource was unlimited access to Nintendo's entire game catalog. Counselors had access to a free game checkout center where they could borrow any game they wanted from Nintendo's internal library anytime they wanted. Nintendo actually encouraged counselors to regularly check out games, as it was key to expanding their knowledge. In addition, there was free access to games everywhere in the facility. Arcade games like Mario and Donkey Kong. Even the break room had numerous consoles set up so you could game while having your lunch.
Actually, they have a training session going.
The next resource was considered by many to be the ultimate key to a gameplay counselor's knowledge. That was the Gameplay Counselor's Binder. The binder was a collective creation shared among counselors, allowing them to exchange tips and tricks for various games. It featured hand-drawn maps, level-specific strategies, and solutions to common in-game challenges, making it a highly coveted resource. Eventually, the binder would be replaced by a higher-tech solution known as Elmo. Elmo was a DOS-based local operating system that counselors could use to quickly look up answers. In many ways, being a Nintendo gameplay counselor may have seemed like the ultimate dream job, but it came with its fair share of downsides and weird rules. To start, a light system was eventually put in place to track how long callers were waiting. If the light turned red on your phone, it meant there was a backlog of calls, and counselors had to scramble to keep up. Supervisors closely monitored this as well as the idle time between calls, with the goal being no more than, wait for it, 7 seconds of idle time between calls. Any longer than this, and you'd certainly hear about it at the next team meeting, leaving little room to catch your breath. Nintendo, being a family-friendly company, also enforced strict censorship rules. Cursing was of course forbidden, though counselors found creative outlets to vent frustrations, like muting the call or holding certain fingers up to the phone. Certain harmless words were also banned. For instance, you couldn't tell a player that their character had died or was killed. That was forbidden. Instead, the word you needed to use was defeated. Another frustrating part of the job for counselors was the restriction placed on giving direct answers. If a caller simply wanted to know how to beat a boss in Zelda II, you couldn't outright tell them to use the reflect spell and crouch in the corner. Instead, you had to provide subtle hints, guiding them to figure it out on their own. This approach was intended to offer players a more rewarding experience. However, when the hotline eventually transitioned to a pay-per-minute service, it raised the question of whether this tactic was also designed to prolong calls and in turn increase revenue. While there may have been some downsides to being a Nintendo gameplay counselor, there were more than enough exciting perks to make the job all worth it. Whenever a new console was released, counselors got one for free. They also enjoyed employee discounts at the Nintendo store and had exclusive access to Cafe Mario, a hidden gem reserved only for Nintendo employees. Long before Universal Studios served up Mario burgers and Princess Peach cupcakes at their theme parks, Cafe Mario was dishing out Princess Peach pepperoni pizza and Shy Guy soda to lucky Nintendo employees. And since it was the late 80s and 90s, right next to Mario Cafe was the designated smoking room. Supervisors often gathered here, so if you were aiming for a promotion, this was the place to be. For those who didn't want to network over a smoke break, there were other ways to stand out. Some counselors had the opportunity to contribute to Nintendo Power magazine, sharing expert tips in the Counselor's Corner, a segment created to guide players through the toughest game challenges.
In Nintendo headquarters, expert game counselors answer your questions. Their source of information, Nintendo Power, your direct connection to the
And that
pro.
brings us to one of the most famous and infamous perks of the job, Nintendo's annual Christmas party. Nintendo went all out, providing limousines for all employees and an open bar, which led to some memorable and chaotic moments. There were reports of smashed mirrors in an elevator, even a scandalous incident where an employee groped Mrs. Claus, leading to their immediate termination. While the holiday parties may have been the most talked about, the perks didn't end there. Counselors were also showered with exclusive swag, the most coveted item being the official Nintendo windbreaker. This jacket, emblazoned with iconic Nintendo characters, became a symbol of status, and it can now be found on eBay for thousands of dollars in some cases. Wearing it in public also came with a touch of fame. Counselors would often get mobbed by kids at the mall, asking counselors for tips about their favorite games. Some counselors even received fan letters and were approached at events like PowerFest, where fans seized the chance to meet their favorite counselors in person. This brush with fame extended into mainstream pop culture as well. Kirk and Candace Cameron shared their frustrations about tough video games, admitting they needed help from a gameplay counselor. Nintendo gameplay counselors were even portrayed in the classic film The Wizard, starring Fred Savage. At its peak, Nintendo employed hundreds of gameplay experts, all dedicated to guiding players through the toughest gaming challenges. But in 2005, with the rise of the internet and the ease of accessing online game walkthroughs, Nintendo retired the gameplay counselor hotline. However, that wasn't the last we'd hear from these video game masters. In 2016, Nintendo brought back the Nintendo Power Hotline for one glorious weekend to celebrate the release of the NES Classic Edition.
Thank you for calling Nintendo's Power Line, which is back for one weekend only to celebrate the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System NES Classic Edition system, now available in store.
Let me know in the comments if you ever called a Nintendo gameplay counselor, and thank you for watching.